years since the attacks on America, September 11th, 2001, we have shared with you many stories of loss, survival, and recovery. This hour on It's Your Call, we take you to ground zero on that day that changed history and show you some never-before-seen images of the rescue and volunteer efforts. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Doyle. This hour, we are joined by two extraordinary guests. Lou Angeli is a firefighter and EMT from Delaware who was among the rescue workers who made their way to Ground Zero almost immediately following the attacks on the World Trade Centers. He's producing a documentary on September 11th and has photos and personal experiences that he'll be sharing with us today. And Edward Terzansky is a national security, intelligence, and political analyst and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute who was with us on that terrible day here on It's Your Call and who has navigated us through many events which has followed it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. I want to start with Lou because you brought this story to It's Your Call, your personal experience and your determination to produce a documentary, not only highlighting the rescue workers, but the many volunteers who showed up on September 11th and in the weeks that followed. Why focus on that particular group?
Well, initially, the rescue effort was undertaken by volunteers. Folks who lived in Lower Manhattan, other agencies, volunteer firemen who came in from Long Island, police agencies. I can recall the first night at Ground Zero at about 11:45, there were a group of Chicago firefighters who had driven all the way in that period of time.
There wasn't a particularly organized effort at the time because mass confusion reigned after the attacks in New York, and yet people got in their cars, as you mentioned, and made their way to Ground Zero, not even knowing if their help would be needed, but they were willing to do it. What does that tell you about the volunteers across America?
Well, I think when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, Americans, and certainly other folks as well, are step up to the plate and do the best that they can to help each other out. But they've proved that at Katrina and other disasters as well.
Of course, on September 11th, we saw those horrible images. First, the buildings under attack, and then the collapse of both the trade centers and the loss of so many lives. We also saw acts of bravery and heroism, and you were there. You were on the ground at Ground Zero. What was the environment like? What was the sense that was in the air?
Well, my greatest recollection is the fact that everybody was very focused on one thing, and that was trying to find survivors initially. It was as if somebody had knocked us all on the head and given us the same energy. We moved on regardless of our affiliation. I worked with firefighters from New York, police officers, people who worked for Amtrak were down there. Anybody who could move debris, anybody who could help out, were there.
We're looking at some of the images that will be part of the documentary, Answering the Call. Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to release these never-before-seen images now, some 8 years later?
What's interesting is initially there wasn't a whole lot of desire to see these images. However, the story that we tell using these images is different than the collapse of the buildings. What we're showing is the rescue and recovery effort, and the fact that there were only two of us who were actually videotaping at that time. These scenes are, I think, a document, a piece of American history.
Yes, it certainly has become a piece of American history. Ed, you were there the day it happened with us on It's Your Call, as I mentioned, and have been with us on every anniversary in the ensuing 8 years. How is America different today, in your opinion, than it was in 2001?
In terms of preparedness, a lot of the problems that the 9/11 Commission talked about that led up to that terrible day have been fixed, or they're on the way to being fixed, or we've got enough structures in place so that we can measure best practices and do all of those administrative bureaucratic things. The thing that is disconcerting for me 8 years on is I think that as far as mindset goes, the American public is in a much different place this year than it had been the same time 8 years ago.
How so?
I get the sense, first of all, that time is taking its toll. There wasn't another attack, therefore the problem wasn't that real. And people have started to rationalize, especially in terms of the way we pushed back at this problem. Just because there has been another attack, and by the way, normally, Lynn, it's the first anniversary, and then we go into fives, the 5-year, the 10-year. 8 is important because it was 8 years from the first attack in '93 until the next one in 2001 that brought the buildings down. And we seem to have forgotten. And I think there is a steely determination and purpose that the country had coming out of that is missing today. And a lot of the courageous attitudes that Lou and his colleagues demonstrated going into a rescue have been sapped by time, and today we kind of look back and say, well, that may have been a one-off affair. And when other events have also jumped in, so that people say, well, who are we? I mean, we do bad things too. Who are we to judge? All of that moral relativism, the kind of muddled thinking, I really think has started to take a toll.
Do you think it's more important now than ever before then for images like these that Lou is sharing with us to be brought to the forefront,
Absolutely.
to remind Americans that, hey, it may have been 8 years since this happened, but you cannot reduce the severity of what happened to us that day?
Think how many children have been born since that moment in time. They haven't seen these images. They may have heard some discussion about it, but we've gotten to the point where, after, I guess it was about 4 or 5 years on, where they stopped showing things because they said it's too painful to see. And now we have discussions about changing Patriots' Day, September 11th, from a commemoration to a day of national service and all this kind of stuff that's got nothing to do with the event. We're forgetting what happened. Images are important, and that's why Lou's work is going to be critical.
Is that one of your primary goals, to make sure that September 11th is not swept to the background?
Of course. Every time someone sees the video, especially those who recall the day, they end up crying, especially folks who were most affected, family members, people like that. And there are firefighters who have joined the fire service who were only 12 at the time.
That's right.
So they don't recall that 343 firefighters, but they know that 343 were lost, but to actually comprehend something as large as that is difficult for them. So when they see this video, they come out with a reaction which is just nothing. They just keep asking me questions and questions and questions. And I try to answer it all, but I'm not really the best person to answer.
Well, in the course of the 8 years since September 11th, have become very good friends with Ellen Saraceni, as you know, and it was her husband, Victor, who was piloting the first plane that hit the World Trade Center. And we've worked together for many years to establish the Garden of Reflection. Them far more than me. Anything that we could do on the show to help, we were glad to do. But I had a conversation with her at the memorial service for this year's anniversary, and she said, quite frankly, she's really concerned that Americans are going to forget September 11th and start to put it, you know, in one of those places that you think about just occasionally, maybe on the anniversary, maybe not. And it really disturbs her and the other family members to think that it's not being acknowledged and remembered perhaps in the way that some think it should be.
Well, let me use a practical illustration. You know, we caught colleague Sheikh Mohammed, who was responsible for this. And he is one of 3 high-value detainees who were waterboarded because